Well, we're going to start a brand new series this morning that I'm calling Family Portrait. And I call it Family Portrait because I can't imagine a more stressful thing than family portraits. Has anybody had a family portrait? Christy knows. We've invited Christy to take some family portraits for us, and she said, I will never do this again. It's the most painful thing in the world. First of all, there's always one person that doesn't look good, right? Everybody looks good, but there's one person that doesn't. They have their eyes closed. They're picking their nose. I don't know. But, when we were kids, Trisha's family would come in for Christmas, and they would always do a family portrait. And so when my kids were little, we would go in there, and one day, my kids usually were very well-behaved kids, but they had a full-on meltdown at Family Portrait at Sears Family Portrait Studios. And Trisha's brother leans over to his wife, and I could hear him, and he goes, my kids will never act like that. And I'm like, oh, this is horrible. Well, a couple of years go by, and Trisha's brother has kids of his own, and then family portrait time comes around over Christmas, and my kids are older and a little more mature, and his kids had a full-on hissy fit. It was the worst ever. It made my kids look like angels, and I just sat back and laughed and laughed. It was awesome. But the interesting thing about family portraits is once you get the picture, the photographer goes into Photoshop and he touches up everybody's face and they gloss it over. And we present this picture as kind of the reality of our family, but really it's not. It doesn't account for all the meltdowns that we had and everybody that didn't look quite right. And I think reality is a little bit like that. We live in the tension between the real and the ideal. And the Bible clearly elevates an ideal. God has a plan for your family. He has a design for what that relationship is going to look like. But oftentimes, the reality of our life doesn't really meet that ideal. And you may be here, and we're starting a family series. Every time we ever talk about family, there's many of us that raise our hand and we go, oh man, my family is not ideal, and you don't know how many marriages I've gone through, and you don't know that my kids don't really talk to me, and it brings about all this emotion. And we wonder, maybe I should just skip this series altogether because it's so painful for me to talk about family. And here's the simple truth. Everybody has dysfunction in their family. I do, and you do. There really is no such thing as a perfect family. There's an old axiom that I often say that everybody is normal until you get to know them. Everybody is normal until you get to know them. When you dig into family relationships, it's a little bit less than ideal. In fact, when you dig into Bible relationships as it talks about family, there's no great examples, is there? You look at Adam and Eve in the Bible, they have Cain and Abel. They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and it doesn't take very long before Cain kills Abel. In the Old Testament, there's bad example after bad example. And you think about Jesus' family. Well, Jesus, of course, he must have had an absolutely perfect family. Mary is his mother. Joseph is his father. They must have the perfect family. But in Luke chapter 2, it records that they went to Jerusalem for Passover, and then they left without Jesus. And the Bible says that they searched for him in Jerusalem and didn't find him for 3 days. Finally, they find him in the temple courts, and he says, well, didn't you know I'd be about my Father's business? Even Mary and Joseph, they lost one of their kids for 3 days. There's a reality, I think, in every family that maybe is a little bit less than ideal. And we want to resolve that tension often by making the ideal something less. We shouldn't do that because we need to elevate Christ's ideal for our family and pursue all that he has for us in those relationships. You could gain the whole world. You could be the smartest person in the world. You could have the most successful business in the world. But if you lose your family, you've lost a lot. It's one of the most significant things that determines your success in life or your failure in life. And it's one of those things that we all have to prioritize and we all have to work at. And fortunately, the Bible has some great principles that will help make our family relationships that much better. If you're a mom raising kids alone, there's some biblical principles that are going to help you. And Lord knows you're heroic, but you probably need all the help you can get. If you're a single dad raising kids, same thing. You need God's help. If you're a wife and a mother, or you're a husband and a father, we need God's help. Because I don't know if you've noticed this, even in our culture, there's not a lot of great examples for what family is supposed to look like. We see sitcoms and we see things on TV and the culture all around us, and we see families just disintegrating before our eyes. We need to all pursue God's ideal for what families ultimately are going to look like. And so we're going to be, over the next several weeks, looking very intently at Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus. It's a book in the Bible called Ephesians. We're going to look at Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6, and we're going to look at one particular verse today. It's found in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. And it says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And Paul is identifying a key principle that if we apply this principle to our family relationships, it will dramatically improve every one of those relationships. It's a principle that Jesus talked about with his disciples. We see it throughout the New Testament. It's something that is encouraged even with the broader church family, that all of us need to apply this one principle that really will change so very much. And the principle is this: mutual submission. You see, God's plan for families is that we operate under mutual submission to one another. That children submit to parents, and wives submit to husbands, and husbands submit to wives, and even fathers submit to their children, and mothers submit to their children, and in the sense that we're all submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And this principle is highlighted so many different places. I'm going to just touch on a couple of them. In Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, he said this in Philippians chapter 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, consider others above yourself, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. Jesus said this in Mark chapter 9, sitting down with his 12 disciples. Listen to this principle as Jesus highlights it. He said, anyone who wants to be first must be last and servant of all. You see, this principle isn't something that you'll read in a magazine. Probably not too many TV psychologists are talking about this principle, but this principle is found throughout the Bible. It's often not elevated in our culture, but it's still so very true for each and every one of us. It'll improve marriages. It'll improve careers. It'll improve your parenting relationships if we can just capture this concept of mutual submission. But there's some obstacles to mutual submissions, isn't there? And I want to highlight just a few of these. One of the obstacles, I think, is fear. That if I lift up this principle in my family, maybe I'm the only one that's going to actually do it. And my life is going to get harder, and everybody else's life is going to get easier, and I'm ultimately going to feel like I'm less than. And I think probably many of us would say, when I'm around my family, when I'm around my parents, my grandparents, my uncles, even around my parents or my kids, after a few days, I generally feel less than. And there's a critical fear inside of our heart that somehow there's going to be this pecking order. And we're going to ultimately end up at the bottom rung of the ladder. And it keeps us from really going all into this principle of mutually submitting to one another. But in regards to leadership, Jesus says a lot. And he says this in Matthew chapter 20. He said, he called his disciples together once again, and you just kind of capture that he wants them to get this. And he says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. But listen to what he says in verse 26. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. See, this concept of mutual submission, it isn't saying you're sitting around your family and you're like, where do you want to go eat? I don't know. I'll go where you want to go. No, I want to go where you want to go. And no one can make a decision. It's not talking about the role of leadership, but it's talking about the operation of leadership. And it's talking about how even people in authority and people in leadership, ultimately, they're servants. They're submitting to one another. It's a way to elevate the people around them, not to make them feel less than. Another obstacle in our life that keeps us from submitting to this is pride. When my brother and I were younger, I would say this phrase to him often, "You're not the boss of me." And he would fight, and he was 6 feet tall in 6th grade. He was a little mutant, and he would wrestle me down to the ground, 3.5 years older than I was. "You're not the boss of me," I'd say. "I don't have to do what you tell me to do. You're not the boss of me." And I think we carry that same attitude into our family relationships. If you've had a terrible 2-year-old, all of a sudden they kind of adopt this principle in their own life, right? At 2 years old, they pick this up, and they're like, you can't have another cookie. And the 2-year-old just looks at you, and you see it rolling in their head. "You're not the boss of me. I'm going to have another cookie, and I'm going to scream my head off till I get it." Teenagers going to their parents, they say, parents will say, "Go clean your room," and the teenager just looks back, and in their head, no matter how they articulate it, "You're not the boss of me." And wives do the same thing, and the husband's saying, "Well, why don't you pick up the kids?" And the wheels are turning. "You're not the boss of me." And husbands say it too. Husbands are looking at their teenagers, they're looking at their wives, and the wives are saying, "Why don't you help me wash the dishes once in a while?" Or, "Why don't you take the kids? Why is that always on me?" And the dad's sitting there saying, "Well, you're not the boss of me." And so really you have a whole family who's sitting there saying, "You're not the boss of me. It's really about me." And you can relate with this, right? Because you walk into any family reunion or walk into a family dinner or at Christmas time when your whole family comes to get together, you kind of have this thought in your head, just like I do often. If everybody would just do what I tell them to do, it'd just be perfect, right? You just need to quit drinking so much. You need to clean up your foul mouth. You need to stop telling that one single joke that you tell me every time that I see you. You need to shut up. You need to talk more. You need to engage more. You need to stop being so needy. You need to spend your money better. You need to stop being so codependent. And you have this money. If everybody would just follow my advice, the world would be a perfect place. And unfortunately, this kind of attitude where we need to be the master of the universe is pervasive in our families, and ultimately it divides us, and it keeps us from adopting this principle that I'm highlighting this morning of mutual submission.